Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. Sometimes standing up for what you believe costs you everything you thought you were. Kara Vigdottir learned both truths when her own father's clan shaved her head and threw her in the dirt for refusing a marriage that would have sold her soul. Cast out and broken, she prepared to face exile alone. But from the shadows came Halvar One-Eye, a battle-scarred warrior who remembered an old debt. He knelt beside her and spoke 4 words that would change both their lives. "You're coming with me." What kind of bond could grow between 2 broken souls on the harsh road ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fjords of Norway carved their way through the landscape like the god's own wounds, deep and unforgiving under the pale northern sky. Here, where the sea met stone in an eternal battle, the clan of Vigdis the Bold had made their home for 7 generations. Their longhouse stood proud against the howling winds, its dragon-carved posts reaching toward the heavens like prayers made of timber and iron. Kara Vigdottir had been born in the shadow of those dragon heads, and for 22 winters she had believed herself their rightful heir. The daughter of a jarl, she had grown tall and strong, with hair the color of winter wheat, and eyes like storm clouds gathering over the North Sea. Her mother had died, bringing her into this harsh world, leaving Kara to be raised by her father's iron will and the grudging wisdom of his warband. From childhood, she had been different. While other girls learned the gentle arts of weaving and brewing, Kara had begged to train with wooden swords. When others whispered soft words by the hearth, she spoke her mind with the force of thunder. Her father had indulged this spirit for a time, even taking pride in her fierce nature when she bested boys twice her size in wrestling matches during the summer gatherings. But pride, Kara learned too late, was a luxury that daughters could not afford. The trouble had begun 3 moons past, when emissaries arrived from the clan of Ragnar the Red. They came bearing gifts of silver arm rings and amber beads, but their true offering was an alliance sealed in blood and marriage. Ragnar's son, Björn the Cruel, sought a bride to cement peace between their feuding territories. The raids and counter-raids that had plagued both clans for a generation could end with a single ceremony. Kara had seen Björn at the midwinter feast 2 years prior. He was a man of 30 winters, with yellow teeth and hands that lingered too long on serving girls. His reputation for cruelty toward women was whispered about in corners, spoken of in hushed tones when the men thought no one was listening. The thought of sharing his bed, of bearing his children, had filled Kara with a cold dread that settled in her bones like winter frost. When her father announced the betrothal, Kara had spoken against it with all the fire in her blood. She had reminded him of her mother's strength, of the battles she herself had won, of the respect she commanded among their people. But Vigdis had looked at her with eyes grown distant and cold, as if seeing a stranger where his daughter once stood. "You will marry Björn Ragnarsson," he had declared before the assembled clan. "This alliance will bring peace to our lands and honor to our line." "I will not," Kara had replied, her voice carrying across the longhouse like the crack of breaking ice. The silence that followed was more terrible than any war cry. In that moment, Kara had sealed her fate without knowing it. The seeds of her destruction had been planted in those 3 simple words. But there had been another presence in those shadows, another set of eyes watching the drama unfold. Halvar One-Eye had arrived with the spring thaw, leading a small warband of 7 men who served no jarl and answered to no clan. They were masterless warriors, selling their swords to whoever could meet their price. Vigdis had hired them to strengthen his defenses against summer raids. But Halvar had come for reasons that ran deeper than silver. The runestone pendant that hung from his neck bore ancient marks, carved with symbols that spoke of oaths and obligations. It was a heavy thing, worn smooth by years of handling, and it served as a constant reminder of debts that honor demanded be paid. Those who knew Halvar's history understood that he was a man haunted by the weight of unpaid obligations, driven by a code that would not let him rest until all accounts were settled. He was perhaps 40 winters old, with iron-grey hair braided with leather cords and a face marked by countless battles. The empty socket where his left eye had once been was hidden beneath a patch of black leather, but his remaining eye was sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. His men followed him not from fear, but from respect, earned through years of shared hardship and honorable conduct. Unlike the household warriors who served Vigdis, Halvar's band was bound together by choice rather than blood or obligation. There was Thorgun the Swift, barely past his 20th year but deadly with a bow. Olaf Ironarm, whose skill with a battle-axe was matched only by his gentle way with injured animals. Eric the Silent, who spoke perhaps 10 words in a day but could track a deer across bare stone. Gunnar Bloodaxe, whose fierce appearance belied a poet's soul. Bjorn the Young, eager to prove himself worthy of his famous name. Magnus Stormcrow, wise in the ways of weather and sailing. And Ulf the Red, whose temper burned as bright as his beard, but whose loyalty ran deeper than the fjords themselves. These men had found in Halvar a leader who asked nothing of them that he would not give himself. He shared their dangers, their hardships, and their meager rewards without reservation. In return, they would follow him into the depths of hell itself if he but asked. On the night before Kara's punishment, Halvar had sat apart from the others, staring into the flames of the great hearth. His weathered fingers had turned the runestone pendant over and over, feeling the weight of obligation that had brought him to this place. Few knew the true reason for his presence in Vigdis's hall, and fewer still would have understood the burden he carried. 15 years earlier, when Kara was but a child of 7 winters, she had saved his life with nothing more than courage and a handful of dried berries. The memory was as clear in his mind as if it had happened yesterday. He had been fleeing through the forest, wounded and alone, pursued by enemies who sought his death. Exhausted and bleeding, he had collapsed beside a stream, certain that his thread of fate was about to be cut. But then a small voice had spoken from the shadows, offering food and shelter to a stranger. The child Kara had found him there, half dead and delirious with fever. Instead of running or calling for help, she had shared her meager meal and helped him find a cave where he could hide until his strength returned. A small eating knife, barely longer than a man's finger but sharp as a needle, had helped him cut away infected flesh and bind his wounds with torn cloth from her own dress. She had visited him for 3 days, bringing food stolen from her father's table and water carried in cupped hands. On the 3rd night, when his fever finally broke, she had simply vanished back into the forest like a woodland spirit. He had searched for her, wanting to know the name of his savior, but by then his enemies had given up the hunt, and duty called him elsewhere. It had taken him years to learn that his rescuer was Kara Vigdottir, daughter of Vigdis the Bold. By then, she had grown from a brave child into a fierce young woman. But Halvar had never forgotten the debt he owed to that small, courageous spirit who had chosen kindness over fear. Now, as he watched the firelight dance across the longhouse walls, he could feel the weight of that debt pressing down upon him like a stone. Tomorrow would bring Kara's trial and punishment, and with it, his chance to finally balance the scales of obligation that had driven him across half of Norway. The other warriors in the hall were already deep in their cups, boasting of past battles and future conquests. But Halvar remained sober, his mind focused on the task ahead. He had come to repay a debt, but he was beginning to suspect that the true reckoning would demand far more than he had initially imagined. As the night deepened and the revelry slowly died away, Halvar made his final preparations. His war axe, a magnificent weapon with a blade polished to mirror brightness, rested against his knee. It was the symbol of his prowess in battle, the tool that had carved his reputation from the bodies of his enemies. Tomorrow, it might be called upon to defend rather than attack, to protect rather than destroy. The runestone pendant seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, as if the very stones of the earth were reminding him of promises made and debts incurred. But Halvar had learned long ago that honor was not a burden to be cast aside when convenient. It was the foundation upon which a man built his legacy. In a few hours, Vigdottir would face the consequences of her defiance. And when that moment came, Halvar One-Eye would be ready to offer her a choice that would change both their destinies forever. The morning of Kara's trial dawned grey and bitter, with ice forming on the edges of the horse troughs and breath hanging in the air like the ghosts of unspoken words. The entire clan had gathered in the great courtyard before the longhouse, their faces stern with the weight of judgment to come. Even the children stood silent, sensing that something terrible and final was about to unfold. At the center of the assembly sat Vigdis the Bold on his carved wooden throne, the marriage contract scroll spread across his knees like a map of his daughter's future. The parchment bore the seals of both clans, pressed into red wax that had hardened like drops of blood. Every word of that document had been negotiated with care, every clause designed to bind not just two young people in matrimony, but two tribes in perpetual peace. Kara had read those terms herself, studying each line with growing horror. She would become Björn's property in all but name, her children destined to carry forward his lineage while her own heritage was absorbed and forgotten. The contract spoke of her as cattle might be traded, valued for her bloodline and breeding potential rather than her spirit or intelligence. When the horns sounded to call the assembly to order, Kara walked into the courtyard with her head held high. She wore her finest dress, deep blue wool embroidered with silver thread, and her wheat-colored hair was braided with ribbons and small silver bells that chimed softly with each step. If she was to face judgment, she would do so as a Jarl's daughter, with all the dignity that title commanded. Kara Vigdottir, her father's voice boomed across the courtyard, formal and cold as winter stone. You stand accused of breaking faith, with your clan, of refusing a lawful betrothal, and of bringing shame upon the house of your fathers. How do you answer these charges? The silence stretched between them like a blade being drawn slowly from its sheath. Kara could feel the weight of every eye upon her, could sense the collective held breath of her people. Many of these men and women had watched her grow from a headstrong child into a fierce young woman. Some had cheered her victories in contests of strength and skill, others had warned that her willful nature would lead to ruin. I answer that I am a free woman of noble birth, Kara replied, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. I answer that no contract signed without my consent can bind my soul to a man I despise. I answer that peace bought with the enslavement of daughters is no peace worth having. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some voices carried approval, but many more held disapproval and fear. The old ways were clear about a daughter's duty to her clan, and Kara's words challenged traditions that stretched back to the time of legends. Vigdis rose from his throne, the marriage contract clutched in his fist. You speak of slavery, but I speak of honor. You speak of enslavement, but I speak of alliance. Your marriage to Björn Ragnarsson will end a generation of bloodshed and secure prosperity for our children's children. What is your personal happiness weighed against the lives of warriors who will die in raids that continue because you are too proud to do your duty? And what is my life weighed against the lives of the women who will suffer under Björn's cruelty? If this marriage proves his nature acceptable, Kara shot back. I have heard the whispers about his treatment of thralls and serving women. I have seen the fear in their eyes when his name is spoken. Would you have your daughter's screams sanctify this peace you seek? The words hung in the air like the sound of breaking glass. Too much truth had been spoken, too many carefully hidden realities dragged into the light. Vigdis's face darkened with rage, but beneath the anger, Kara caught a glimpse of something else. Shame, perhaps, or the weight of knowledge he had tried to ignore. Enough, he declared, his voice shaking with fury. "You have spoken words that cannot be taken back, shown defiance that cannot be forgiven. The contract was signed in good faith, sealed with oaths before the gods. To break it now would brand our clan as oath-breakers and cost us our honor among all the tribes of the north." From the crowd, Björn Ragnarsson himself stepped forward. He was exactly as Kara remembered, tall and broad-shouldered, but with a softness around his middle that spoke of too much feasting and too little honest labor. His yellow beard was braided with gold wire, and his clothes were rich with embroidered designs, but there was something in his pale eyes that made Kara's skin crawl. "Perhaps the maiden simply needs time to consider the wisdom of this match," Björn said, his voice smooth as honey poured over poison. "I am known to be patient with spirited horses until they learn proper behavior. I suspect I will find similar patience for a spirited bride." The implication in his words was clear to all who heard them, and Kara felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Here was a man who spoke of breaking women as others might speak of training hounds, who saw cruelty as a tool to be wielded with precision and pride. "I would sooner marry a serpent," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard. "At least a serpent's nature is honest." The insult struck Björn like a physical blow, and his face flushed red with humiliation and rage. Around the courtyard, warriors of both clans shifted uneasily, hands drifting toward sword hilts. The carefully negotiated peace suddenly balanced on the edge of a blade, threatened by the honest words of one defiant woman. "That is enough," Vigdis roared, his control finally snapping. "You will marry Björn Ragnarsson as agreed, or you will face the consequences of your defiance. Choose now, daughter, your duty or your exile." Kara looked around the courtyard at the faces of her people, searching for some sign of support, some indication that others shared her revulsion at this match. But she saw only fear and resignation, the weight of tradition pressing down upon them all like stones piled upon a grave. "Then I choose exile," she said quietly, but her words carried clearly in the morning air. "I choose my own path over the one you would force upon me." What followed was swift and brutal. At Vigdis's signal, 4 of his strongest warriors seized Kara's arms, holding her fast, while the clan's wise woman approached with a razor-sharp knife and a bowl of cold water. The punishment for a daughter's defiance was ancient and terrible. The cutting away of her identity along with her hair, the stripping of rank and status that would mark her as an outcast among all civilized people. They forced her to kneel in the dirt, while the wise woman began her work. Each cut of the blade took away another lock of her beautiful hair, each fallen strand representing years of care and pride, now reduced to nothing. The silver bells that had adorned her braids lay scattered in the mud like broken promises, their music silenced forever. As the last of her hair fell away, leaving her scalp bare and vulnerable to the cold morning air, Kara felt something die inside her chest. Not her spirit, that burned as fiercely as ever, but her faith in the bonds of blood and kinship that she had believed unbreakable. Her own father had chosen political expedience over his daughter's welfare, had valued the opinions of strangers above the pleas of his own child. When the cutting was finished, they stripped away her fine dress and replaced it with rough, homespun, the clothing of a thrall or beggar. The silver jewelry that marked her rank was torn from her arms and throat, leaving red marks on her skin where the metal had pressed. "Kara Vigdottir is dead," the wise woman proclaimed in a voice that carried ancient authority. "In her place stands a nameless exile, cast out from clan and kinship, welcome in no hall, claimed by no bloodline. Let all who see her know that she chose this fate through her own stubborn pride." They threw her into the dirt then, this woman who had once been a jarl's daughter, and left her lying there while the crowd slowly dispersed. The marriage contract remained intact, its seals unbroken, but the bride it promised had been transformed into something else entirely, a cautionary tale, a broken thing, a reminder of what happened to daughters who forgot their place. As evening approached and the courtyard emptied, Kara remained where she had fallen, too numb with shock and grief to move. The cold seeped through her rough clothing, and her bare scalp ached with each breath of wind, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emptiness that had opened in her heart. She prepared to rise, to walk away from everything she had ever known, and disappear into the wilderness like the exile she had become. But then a shadow fell across her, and she heard the sound of someone kneeling in the dirt beside her. "You're coming with me," said a voice she recognized, though she had rarely heard it speak. Halvar One-Eye knelt beside her broken form, his weathered face gentle with understanding, and his remaining eye bright with purpose. For the first time since her ordeal began, Kara felt something stir within her chest that might have been hope. Kara stared up at Halvar One-Eye, through eyes still swollen from tears she refused to shed in public. The warrior's scarred face was illuminated by the dying light of the courtyard torches, casting deep shadows across the empty socket where his left eye had once been. His remaining eye, however, held a warmth that seemed impossible in a man so marked by violence. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the day's ordeal. "Why would you burden yourself with a nameless exile?" Halvar's weathered hand moved to the war axe that hung at his side, its polished blade catching the torchlight like captured lightning. The weapon was magnificent, double-bladed and perfectly balanced, with a handle wrapped in leather, worn smooth by years of use. It had tasted the blood of countless enemies, had carved Halvar's reputation from the bodies of men who had underestimated the one-eyed warrior's skill. "Every man carries debts," he said quietly, his voice like gravel shifted by wind. "Some are paid in silver, some in blood. But the heaviest debts are those of honor, and they can only be settled by choice, not force." He rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a man half his age, then extended his hand toward her. "Your father made his choice. Björn made his. Now I offer you a different one." Kara looked at that outstretched hand, scarred and calloused, marked by decades of sword work and hard living. It was not the soft palm of a nobleman or the smooth fingers of a poet. This was a warrior's hand, honest in its violence and generous in its protection. She grasped it and allowed him to pull her to her feet. The simple act felt like emerging from a grave, like drawing breath after drowning. For the first time since her trial began, she was not alone. "My men are preparing to leave at first light," Halvar said. "We have fulfilled our contract with your father, and there is nothing more to keep us here. You can come with us, or you can walk into the wilderness alone. The choice is yours." Around the edges of the courtyard, Kara could see movement in the shadows. Halvar's warband was quietly gathering their gear, loading pack horses and checking weapons with the efficient calm of men who had made such preparations countless times before. They moved like ghosts, making no sound that might draw unwanted attention from the Longhouse guards. Thorgun the Swift paused in his packing to glance toward them, his young face troubled. At barely 20 winters, he was the youngest of Halvar's men, quick with a bow and quicker with a jest. But tonight, his usual humor was nowhere to be seen. Taking in an exile, especially one who had brought such dishonor upon herself, was not a decision any warrior made lightly. "The men will not welcome this," Kara said, reading the doubt in Thorgun's expression and seeing it reflected in the faces of the others. "I bring nothing but trouble to your band. The men follow me because they trust my judgment," Halvar replied. "They will accept my decision because they know I would not make it without good reason." As if summoned by his words, Olaf Ironarm approached them across the courtyard. The massive warrior moved with surprising gentleness for a man of his size, his famous battle-axe hanging peacefully at his side. His beard was streaked with premature grey, and his eyes held the patient kindness of someone who had seen enough violence to value mercy. "Halvar," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old friendship. "Are you certain about this path? Taking an exile puts us all at risk. No clan will welcome us if they believe we harbor oath-breakers." "Kara Vigdottir broke no oath," Halvar replied firmly. "She refused to be sold like cattle, nothing more. If that makes her an oath-breaker, then honor itself has become corrupted. Olaf studied Kara with eyes that seemed to see deeper than the surface. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear and uncertainty that churned in her stomach. Whatever judgment he made would likely sway the others, and she sensed that this gentle giant's opinion carried weight among the warband. "You have your father's stubborn streak," he said finally. But there was no condemnation in his words. "And perhaps that is not entirely a weakness." He turned to Halvar. "If you vouch for her, that is enough for me. But the others will need convincing." As if responding to a silent signal, the rest of the warband began to gather around them. Eric the Silent materialized from the shadows like smoke given form, his weathered face unreadable. Björnar Bloodaxe approached with his usual scowl, though Kara noticed his hand rested easily on his sword hilt rather than gripping it with intent. Magnus Stormcrow stroked his grey beard thoughtfully, while Ulf the Red's expression showed open skepticism. Bjorn the Young hung back slightly, his face eager but uncertain. At 17 winters, he was still proving himself among these seasoned warriors, still earning his place through deed rather than birthright. The addition of another uncertain element to their band clearly troubled him. "So," Gunnar said bluntly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never learned to soften his words, "we are to take Invictus's daughter? The one who brought shame on her bloodline and dishonor to her clan." "I brought honesty to a situation built on lies," Kara replied before Halvar could speak. "If that is shame, then I wear it proudly." Gunnar's scowl deepened, but Magnus Stormcrow chuckled softly. "She has spirit, at least. That counts for something in our line of work. Spirit does not fill empty bellies or turn aside sword blades," Ulf the Red countered. "What skills does she bring? Can she fight? Can she track? Can she tend wounds or mend gear?" The questions struck Kara like physical blows, each one highlighting her uselessness to a band of professional warriors. She had been raised as a nobleman's daughter, taught to manage a household and negotiate alliances. But these skills seemed laughably inadequate in the harsh world she now faced. "I can learn," she said quietly, hating the weakness she heard in her own voice. "Learning takes time," Bjorn the Young said, his youth making him bold, where experience might have counseled discretion. "Time when you consume food without contributing to our survival. Time when you slow us down and make us vulnerable." "Enough," Halvar said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept these disparate men together through countless dangers. "Kara comes with us not because of what she can do, but because of what she has already done. 15 years ago, she saved my life when she was nothing but a child with courage larger than her body. That debt remains unpaid, and I will not let it stand unbalanced." The men exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way of warriors who had shared blood and hardship. Whatever story lay behind Halvar's words, it was clearly not one he had shared before. The revelation carried weight among them, shifting the balance of their reluctance. "If Halvar vouches for her, that settles it," Eric the Silent said, speaking more words at once than many had heard from him in months. "We follow where he leads." One by one, the others nodded their agreement, though some did so with obvious reservations. Kara felt a strange mixture of gratitude and resentment at being accepted not for her own worth, but because of a debt she barely remembered creating. As the warband dispersed to complete their preparations, Halvar remained beside her in the courtyard. The sounds of the longhouse, laughter and singing from the great hall, seemed to come from another world entirely. "They will test you," he said quietly, "not with cruelty, but with the simple hardships of life on the road. You will be hungry, cold, and exhausted. You will doubt yourself 100 times before we reach our destination." "And where is our destination?" Kara asked. Halvar's smile was barely visible in the darkness. "That remains to be seen. For now, it is enough that we have a direction to travel." As the first stars appeared overhead, Kara realized that her old life had truly ended. Whatever came next would be carved from her own choices rather than inherited from her bloodline. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The warband departed before dawn, while the longhouse still slumbered and the guards dozed at their posts. Kara rode behind Halvar on his sturdy gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, as they picked their way carefully down the steep path from her father's hall. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, and the only sounds were the soft clip of hooves on stone and the distant cry of gulls wheeling over the dark water. As they crested the first ridge, Kara turned for one last look at the place of her birth. The dragon-carved posts of the longhouse caught the first rays of sunlight, gleaming like gold against the grey sky. For a moment, homesickness threatened to overwhelm her, but then she remembered the cold hatred in her father's eyes and the cruel promise in Björn's smile. She faced forward and did not look back again. They rode in silence for the first few miles, following ancient paths that wound through forests of pine and birch. Halvar's warband moved with the easy coordination of men who had traveled together for years, each knowing his place and role without need for spoken commands. They were ghosts passing through the landscape, leaving barely a trace of their passage. It was Thorgun the Swift who finally broke the silence, guiding his horse alongside theirs with a boyish grin that seemed out of place among such hardened warriors. "So, lady," he said with mock formality, "what great deed did you perform to earn our leader's protection? Did you slay a dragon? Outwit the gods themselves?" "I fed a stranger," Kara replied simply, her voice barely carrying over the sound of hoofbeats. Thorgun's grin faltered slightly. "Fed a stranger?" From his position at the head of their small column, Halvar's voice carried back to them, rough with old memory. 15 winters ago, I was running through the deep forest east of here, wounded and hunted. 3 men had died trying to kill me, but the 4th had put an arrow through my shoulder before I could reach him. The wound was going bad, and I was burning with fever. The other warriors had drawn closer now, their horses forming a loose circle around Halvar as he continued his tale. Even Eric the Silent seemed to lean forward, hungry for a story their leader had never shared. I collapsed by a stream, certain that the ravens would soon feast on my corpse. But then a small voice spoke from the trees, asking if I was hurt. Halvar's hand moved unconsciously to the runestone pendant at his throat, his fingers tracing the worn symbols carved into its surface. A child emerged from the shadows, a girl of perhaps 7 winters, with wheat-colored braids and eyes like storm clouds. Kara felt a flutter of memory, fragments of images half-remembered from childhood. A man by the water, bleeding and broken. Her mother's small eating knife clutched in her tiny hands as she helped cut away infected flesh. The taste of dried berries shared in the darkness of a cave. She had nothing but a handful of berries and her mother's knife, Halvar continued. But she shared what little she had with a stranger who might have been her enemy. For 3 days, she brought me food stolen from her father's table and tended my wounds with the skill of a grown healer. When the fever finally broke, she vanished like a wood spirit, leaving only this behind. He reached into his leather pouch and withdrew something small and worn. Kara's eating knife, the blade now polished to mirror brightness, and the bone handle carved with new runes. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition flooded through her. The knife had been her mother's, passed down through generations of women in her line. She had thought it lost forever after that strange encounter in the woods. "I searched for her," Halvar said, his voice soft with old regret. "I wanted to know the name of the child who had saved my life, wanted to repay the kindness she had shown. But by the time I learned she was Vigdis's daughter, she had grown into a young woman, safe in her father's hall. I told myself the debt could wait, that there would be time to balance the scales properly." Magnus Stormcrow stroked his grey beard thoughtfully. "And yet you came to serve her father." "That was no coincidence, no," Halvar agreed. "When word reached me that Vigdis sought to hire swords for the summer season, I knew the time had come to repay what I owed. I thought perhaps I could serve honorably and consider the debt settled." He turned in his saddle to look at Kara, his remaining eye bright with purpose. "I did not expect to find that child's courage burning just as fiercely in the woman she had become." Olaf Ironarm nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his weathered features. She saved more than your life that day. She saved your honor as well, by teaching you that kindness could exist without expectation of reward. A lesson worth remembering, Eric the Silent added, his rare words carrying extra weight for their scarcity. The revelation had shifted something fundamental in the group's dynamic. Where before Kara had been a burden grudgingly accepted, she was now something else, a connection to their leader's past. A reminder of the debt that bound them all to something larger than mere survival, but not everyone was ready to embrace this new understanding. Ulf the Red guided his horse closer, his expression still skeptical. "A pretty story," he said gruffly, "but childhood kindness does not make a warrior. The road ahead will test more than gentle hearts." "Then we will see what she is made of," Gunnar Bloodaxe replied, though his tone had lost much of its earlier hostility. "The mountains care nothing for bloodlines or pretty speeches. They strip away all pretense and show a person's true nature." As if to emphasize his words, the path ahead began to climb more steeply, winding through stands of ancient pine toward the high passes that would carry them beyond the reach of Vigdis's authority. The horses labored up the rocky slopes, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Kara felt every muscle in her body protesting the unaccustomed strain of riding, but she gritted her teeth and endured without complaint. Around her, the warband moved with the easy endurance of men accustomed to hardship, their faces showing none of the discomfort she felt, burning through her legs and back. By midday, they had reached a small clearing where a spring bubbled up from beneath a cluster of moss-covered stones. Halvar called a halt, and the men dismounted to water their horses and rest their aching muscles. Kara slid down from the gelding's back and immediately stumbled, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. Thorgun caught her arm before she could fall, his young face sympathetic. "First day is always the worst," he said quietly. "Your body will adapt if you give it time, and if it does not?" Nahara asked, massaging her cramped thighs. "Then we leave you for the wolves," Bjorn the Young said, with the casual cruelty of someone still proving his toughness. But even as he spoke, he was pulling dried meat from his pack and offering it to her with grudging generosity. As they rested by the spring, Kara found herself studying the men who had accepted her into their ranks. Each bore the scars of countless battles. Each carried himself with the confident ease of a professional killer. Yet there was something else about them, something that spoke of deeper bonds than mere shared danger. They were a brotherhood, forged not by blood, but by choice, bound together by respect for their leader and trust in each other's competence. It was a kind of family she had never experienced in her father's hall, where loyalty was demanded rather than earned, and authority flowed from bloodline rather than merit. When they resumed their journey, Kara noticed that the knife Halvar had shown them was now tucked securely in her belt, its familiar weight a comfort against her hip. The blade that had once saved a stranger's life had found its way home at last, carrying with it the promise that old debts could indeed be repaid. 3 days into their journey, the torn clan banner appeared. Eric the Silent found it first, a scrap of blue and silver cloth caught on a thorn bush beside the mountain path. The fabric was rich wool, embroidered with the symbols of Vigdis's house, the roaring bear and crossed axes that had marked Kara's birthright for 22 years. Now it hung in tatters, deliberately shredded, and left as a message for any who might follow. Halvar examined the banner carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the embroidered threads. "Your father's men," he said quietly. "They want us to know they are coming." Kara felt her stomach turn to ice. She had hoped that her exile would be the end of it, that Vigdis would be content to let her disappear into the wilderness rather than pursue her further. But the torn banner told a different story, one of unfinished business and wounded pride that demanded satisfaction. "How many?" Magnus Stormcrow asked, his grey eyes scanning the surrounding forest with the attention of a man who had survived 40 winters by reading signs others missed. 6 horses, moving fast," Eric replied, kneeling beside the path to study tracks invisible to untrained eyes. "They passed here less than an hour ago, riding hard enough to lame their mounts if they keep this pace." Thorgun spat into the dirt, his boyish face hardening with anger. So much for clan loyalty. They exile her, then hunt her down like a common criminal. It is not that simple, Kara said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. The marriage contract was signed and witnessed. My refusal has made my father appear weak before the other clans, and Björn Ragnarsson will demand satisfaction for the insult. She pulled her rough cloak tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her like a stone. These men had risked their safety to help her, and now they faced danger because of choices she had made in defiance and pride. We could disappear into the deep forest, Olaf Ironarm suggested, his massive hands already checking the straps on his battle axe. Let them exhaust themselves, searching empty paths while we circle back toward the coast. Running makes us look guilty, Gunnar Bloodaxe countered, his scarred face grim with the prospect of violence. Better to meet them openly and settle this with honor. Honor? Ulf the Red laughed harshly. What honor is there in fighting men who pursue an exile beyond the boundaries of law? They have no right to demand anything from us. But Halvar was studying the torn banner with an expression that spoke of deeper understanding. This is not about law or honor, he said slowly. This is about fear. Vigdis knows that Kara's defiance will inspire other daughters to question their father's choices. He cannot allow that seed to take root. The truth of his words struck Kara like a physical blow. Her refusal to marry Björn had been more than personal rebellion. It had been an act of revolution that threatened the very foundations of how their society was ordered. If daughters could choose their own paths, if women could refuse the bargains made with their lives, then everything would change. Then they will not stop, she said quietly. Even if we evade them now, they will keep coming. My very existence is a threat to everything they believe. Good, said a voice from behind them. They turned to see Bjorn the Young emerging from the trees, his arms full of deadwood for their evening fire. Despite his youth, there was steel in his voice that had not been there when they started their journey. Let them fear. Let them lose sleep wondering where you are and what example you might be setting. Change always begins with someone willing to stand alone. Magnus Stormcrow chuckled at the boy's fierce words, spoken like a true poet-warrior. Perhaps there is hope for your generation after all. As they made camp that evening in a sheltered grove, Kara found herself reflecting on the strange turns her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a Jarl's daughter, secure in her position and certain of her future. Now she was a nameless exile, dependent on the kindness of masterless warriors and hunted by the very people who should have protected her. Yet there was something liberating about this new existence, something that spoke to a part of her spirit that had always felt caged in her father's hall. For the first time in her life, her choices were truly her own, their consequences falling on her shoulders alone, rather than being absorbed by clan loyalty and blood obligation. You are thinking dangerous thoughts, Halvar said, settling beside her near the small fire they had built. His remaining eye reflected the dancing flames, and his voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to read the human heart as clearly as tracks in the mud. I am thinking that perhaps exile is not the worst fate that could befall a person, Kara replied honestly. There is freedom in having nothing left to lose. Freedom, yes, Halvar agreed, but also responsibility. The choices you make now will echo through the years ahead, shaping not just your own fate, but the fate of everyone who follows your example. Around their small fire, the other warriors were preparing for sleep, checking weapons and gear, with the unconscious efficiency of men who lived always on the edge of violence. Yet there was peace in their movements, a contentment that came from knowing their place in the world and trusting the men beside them. Tell me about your band, Kara said, seeking to understand the bonds that held these disparate men together. How did you come to lead them? Halvar was quiet for so long that she began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain carefully controlled. I was like you once, he said, cast out from my clan for choices that others could not forgive. The difference was that I had skills they needed. I could fight, could lead, could make the hard decisions that others shrank from. One by one, these men found their way to me, each carrying his own burdens and seeking his own redemption. And you gave it to them? We gave it to each other, Halvar corrected. Redemption is not something that can be granted by another person. It must be earned through deed and choice, built up slowly like a wall raised stone by stone. In the darkness beyond their fire, something rustled in the underbrush. Perhaps a deer seeking water, perhaps something more dangerous. The warriors stirred but did not reach for weapons, trusting Eric's ability to distinguish between genuine threats and forest noises. They will catch up to us tomorrow, Halvar said with quiet certainty. The question is what we do when they arrive. Kara stared into the flames, seeing her reflection dancing in the fire's heart. The girl who had been Vigdis's daughter was truly dead, but what was being born in her place remained to be seen. Tomorrow would bring choices that could not be undone, consequences that would ripple through the years ahead. We face them, she said finally, surprised by the steel in her own voice. We face them and let them see what their exile has created. The torn clan banner lay in the dirt beside their fire, its proud symbols reduced to meaningless scraps. But looking at it now, Kara felt no sorrow for what it represented. Some things were worth more than the symbols of belonging, and she was beginning to understand what those things might be. The weathered map that Magnus Stormcrow spread across a flat stone the next morning showed paths that few men knew existed. Drawn on sealskin with berry ink and charcoal, it revealed secret routes through the mountains, used by traders who preferred to avoid the toll-gatherers and bandits that plagued the main roads. The ancient document had been passed down through generations of merchants and smugglers, each adding their own discoveries to its growing web of hidden ways. Here, Magnus said, his gnarled finger tracing a line that seemed to disappear into the heart of the mountains. The Serpent's Path. It winds through caverns and narrow defiles where 6 men could hold off an army. But it leads to the northern trading routes, where we can lose ourselves among the merchants. Halvar studied the map with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. How long? 4 days if we push hard. 6 if we take our time and avoid breaking the horse's legs on the rough ground. Magnus rolled the map carefully, protecting it from the morning dew that clung to everything like tears. But once we're on that path, there's no turning back. The passes are treacherous, and a single mistake could kill us all. As they broke camp and prepared to move deeper into the wilderness, Kara found herself studying the men around her with new understanding. Each of them had made the choice to follow this dangerous route, rather than abandon her to face her father's justice alone. The weight of their sacrifice pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Thorgen approached her as she struggled to secure her few possessions to the pack-horse, his young face serious with purpose. "Here," he said, pulling a curved hunting bow from his gear. "Magnus found this at a trading post last summer. It's sized for someone smaller than our usual fighters. The bow was beautiful work, crafted from yew wood and horn with a grip wrapped in soft leather. Kara had shot arrows before. Her father had insisted she learn the basics of archery along with her other skills, but this weapon was finer than anything she had ever held. "I cannot take this," she protested. "If we face danger, you will need every weapon." "A weapon is useless in the hands of someone who cannot draw it properly," Thorgen replied with a grin. "Besides, the first lesson of survival is that everyone must contribute what they can. Your contribution starts with learning to defend yourself." As they began their ascent into the high passes, the character of the landscape changed dramatically. The gentle hills and meadows of the lower valleys gave way to stark stone walls and treacherous scree slopes, where a single misplaced step could send horse and rider tumbling into the void. The air grew thin and cold, making every breath feel like a struggle. But it was during this demanding climb that Kara began to find her strength. The softness of her former life fell away like old skin, replaced by muscles hardened through necessity and endurance tested by constant challenge. When Olaf's horse stumbled and nearly lost its footing on a narrow ledge, she was the first to dismount and help guide the frightened animal to safety. "Well done," the big warrior said simply. But his approval carried the weight of hard-won respect. The evenings brought different challenges as Kara learned the routines of life on the trail. She gathered firewood with Bjorn the Young, learning to identify the dry deadfall that would burn without smoke. She helped Eric the Silent tend the horses, absorbing his wordless lessons about reading the animal's health and mood. Most importantly, she began training with the bow Thorgan had given her, developing the arm strength and eye that would be necessary if she hoped to contribute to their survival. It was during one of these evening practice sessions that Gunnar Bloodaxe approached her, his scarred face thoughtful. The older warrior had been the most skeptical of her presence, his acceptance grudging and conditional. But as he watched her draw the bowstring and release arrow after arrow into a makeshift target, something shifted in his expression. "Your form is improving," he said, settling on a nearby boulder to observe her practice. "But you are still thinking too much. Archery is like swordplay. The moment you start calculating angles and distances, you have already missed your target. Then how does one improve without thinking?" Kara asked, lowering the bow and wiping sweat from her forehead. "By trusting your instincts and letting your body learn the motion until it becomes as natural as breathing." Gunnar picked up one of her arrows, examining the straightness of its shaft and the balance of its fletching. "A warrior who thinks in battle is a dead warrior. The mind moves too slowly when death comes calling." That night, as they huddled around their small fire in a cave that offered protection from the mountain winds, a traveling merchant's caravan appeared on the path below them. The traders moved with lanterns and torches, their pack animals heavily laden with goods bound for the northern markets. From their hidden vantage point, Halvar's band watched the procession pass, like ghosts observing the world of the living. "News travels with the merchants," Magnus observed quietly. "They carry more than trade goods on these mountain paths." As if responding to his words, fragments of conversation drifted up from the caravan below. The traders spoke of clan wars erupting in the southern fjords, of alliances broken and blood feuds rekindled. Kara's name was mentioned more than once, always in the context of the shame she had brought upon her father's house and the chaos that had followed her exile. The marriage was to seal peace between Vigdis and Ragnar. One merchant was saying to his companion, "Now both clans mass for war, and every small lord in the region must choose sides or face destruction." Kara felt her heart sink as the full consequences of her defiance became clear. The personal choice she had made in refusing Björn's hand had indeed sparked the wider conflict that Halvar had predicted. Young men would die in battles fought over her stubborn pride, and their blood would stain her conscience forever. "This is not your fault," Halvar said quietly, reading the guilt in her expression. "The peace they sought was built on foundations of sand. Your refusal may have been the spark, but the tinder was already dry and waiting. Tell that to the mothers who will weep for their sons," Kara replied bitterly. "And what of the daughters who will not be sold into marriage with cruel men?" Olaf Ironarm countered gently. "Change always carries a price, but sometimes the cost of staying the same is higher." As the merchant caravan disappeared into the darkness below, Kara found herself torn between regret for the chaos she had unleashed and a growing sense that perhaps some changes were worth fighting for. The girl who had been raised to accept her fate without question was truly dead, but the woman emerging in her place was still learning what she believed and what she was willing to sacrifice. For those beliefs, the weathered map that would guide them to safety lay safely tucked in Magnus's pack, its ancient paths offering hope of escape from immediate danger. But Kara was beginning to understand that some journeys could not be mapped, and that the most important discoveries were made not in distant places, but in the depths of one's own heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and perhaps the confrontation they had been avoiding. But tonight, surrounded by men who had chosen to risk their lives for her freedom, Kara felt something she had never experienced in her father's hall. The warmth of belonging to a family bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. The blood-stained letter arrived with the dawn, carried by a raven that should not have been able to find them in the mountain wilderness. The great black bird landed directly in their camp, ignoring the horses' nervous whickering and the men's startled movements toward their weapons. It fixed Halvar with one bright eye and extended its leg. Where a small scroll was bound with silver wire, Eric the Silent approached the bird with the caution of a man who understood that ravens served powers beyond mortal comprehension. The creature allowed him to remove the message, then launched itself skyward with a harsh cry that echoed off the mountain walls like a herald's trumpet. "The seal," Magnus breathed, studying the wax that bound the scroll. "That is not Vigdis's mark." Indeed, the seal bore symbols that none of them recognized, a tree with twisted roots embracing a crown, pressed into wax that had once been white but was now stained dark with what could only be blood. Halvar broke the seal carefully, his weathered fingers trembling slightly as he unrolled the parchment. What he read there drained the color from his face like water poured from a cracked vessel. His remaining eye widened with shock, and for a moment the composed mask he always wore slipped entirely, revealing the stunned disbelief beneath. "What is it?" Kara asked, alarmed by the change in his expression. Halvar looked at her with something approaching pity, the scroll trembling in his hands. "Your true mother was not the woman who died giving you birth," he said quietly. "She was Astrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Wise, who ruled the northern clans before the Great Plague took his line." The words hit Kara like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the world spin around her. "That is impossible. My mother was Ingrid, wife to Vigdis. I've seen her grave marker, heard the stories told to hide a truth that would have shaken kingdoms." Halvar interrupted gently. "According to this letter, Astrid bore you to a man who was not her husband. A love affair that would have destroyed the alliance between the northern and southern clans. When you were born, you were given to Vigdis and his barren wife to raise, while Astrid was quietly married off to a distant lord and told her child had died." Kara sank to her knees in the dirt, her mind reeling as everything she had believed about herself crumbled like ancient parchment. The woman she had called mother, whose memory she had treasured, had been a lie. The father she had defied was not her father at all. Her entire identity, built on the foundation of blood and birthright, was nothing but an elaborate deception. "Who sent this?" she whispered, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Your true father," Halvar replied, his voice heavy with implications. "Jarl Eric Bloodaxe of the Iron Hills, last surviving heir of the northern royal line. He's been watching you from afar all these years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth." The letter continued, explaining in careful detail how Kara's defiance of the arranged marriage had provided the perfect opportunity for her true heritage to be revealed. Eric Bloodaxe had no legitimate heirs, and the northern clans would need a leader when he finally joined his ancestors in Valhalla. A daughter who had proven her courage by standing against injustice would be exactly the kind of ruler they needed. But there was more, and it was this revelation that truly shook Kara to her core. Vigdis had known the truth all along. Her supposed father had raised her with full knowledge that she was not his blood, had accepted gold from Eric Bloodaxe to keep the secret, and had only agreed to the marriage contract with Björn because he wanted to be rid of a burden that reminded him daily of his wife's inability to bear children. "He knew," she said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "All those years, all the times he spoke of family honor and bloodline, he knew I was not his daughter." "More than knew," Halvar said grimly, scanning the rest of the letter. "He actively conspired to remove you from any position where you might discover your true heritage. The marriage to Björn was meant to take you far from the northern territories, where Eric's agents might find you and reveal the truth." Suddenly, many things that had never made sense clicked into place in Kara's mind. Why Vigdis had always seemed distant with her, even in childhood. Why he had been so quick to accept her exile, rather than trying to negotiate with Björn's clan. Why the punishment had been so brutal and final, designed not just to shame her, but to drive her completely away from any chance of discovering her real parentage, the men of Halvar's. Warband watched this revelation unfold with expressions ranging from amazement to concern. They had agreed to protect an exiled daughter, not to become embroiled in the succession politics of the northern kingdoms. The implications of harboring the true heir to Eric Bloodaxe's throne were staggering. "This changes everything," Ulf the Red said bluntly. "We are no longer sheltering a nameless exile. We are protecting a woman with a legitimate claim to rule half of Norway, a claim that will be disputed by every ambitious jarl between here and the Northern Sea," Gunnar added grimly. "Blood always attracts blood, and royal blood attracts the worst kinds of attention." But Halvar was studying the letter with a different kind of intensity, his strategic mind already working through the possibilities this revelation presented. "Eric Bloodaxe does not make this offer lightly," he said slowly. "He has been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment to bring his daughter home. And what makes him think I would want to claim this inheritance?" Kara asked, anger beginning to burn through her shock. "I have just escaped one set of chains forged by family obligation. Why would I willing step into another?" The letter, as if anticipating her resistance, provided an answer that struck directly at her deepest concerns. Eric Bloodaxe wrote of the changes that could be made if a ruler emerged who understood the cost of forcing daughters into unwanted marriages. He spoke of laws that could be written to protect women's rights to choose their own paths, of traditions that could be changed to value courage over compliance. He offers you the chance to prevent other daughters from suffering as you have suffered, Halvar observed. The power to change the very customs that drove you into exile. Kara stared at the blood-stained parchment, seeing in its words both opportunity and trap. The throne Eric Bloodaxe offered would give her the authority to reshape society itself, to ensure that no other woman would be forced to choose between soul-crushing marriage and shameful exile. But accepting that throne would also mean embracing a destiny she had never chosen, stepping into a role that would consume her life as surely as marriage to Björn would have done. "There is more," Halvar said quietly, turning to the final portion of the letter. "Eric Bloodaxe is dying. The wasting sickness has taken hold of him, and the healers say he has perhaps one season left before the ravens call his name. If you are to claim your inheritance, it must be soon." The urgency of the situation pressed down on them like the weight of the mountains themselves. In the distance, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, Vigdis's men, finally catching up to their trail. But now those pursuers represented more than just an angry father seeking to reclaim his disobedient daughter. They were agents of a conspiracy that had stolen her true identity and hidden her rightful heritage for more than 20 years. "So," Thorgyn said, his young voice steady despite the enormity of what they faced, "do we flee deeper into the mountains? Or do we turn north toward the Iron Hills and a destiny none of us expected?" Kara looked around at the faces of the men who had risked everything to protect her, seeing in their expressions the same choice that now confronted her. They could continue running, remaining always one step ahead of those who would use her for their own purposes. Or they could turn and face a future that promised both great power and terrible responsibility. The blood-stained letter crackled in the mountain wind, its revelations having shattered one life and offered the chance to build another. But this time, Kara realized, the choice was truly hers to make. No father could force it upon her, no custom could demand it of her, no tradition could bind her to a path she did not choose to walk. For the first time in her life, she was completely free to decide her own fate. The question was whether she had the courage to embrace a destiny that could change the world, or whether she would choose the simpler path of anonymous exile in distant lands. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, marking the end of their time for contemplation. Whatever choice she made would have to be made now, in this moment, with consequences that would echo through the ages. The ancient seal ring that Halvar drew from his pack was a thing of terrible beauty, wrought from gold so pure it seemed to glow with inner light even in the grey mountain dawn. The band was thick as a man's thumb, engraved with the twisted tree and crown symbol that had marked the blood-stained letter, while its face bore a ruby the size of a child's eye that captured and held the morning sun like frozen fire. Eric Bloodaxe sent this with instructions that it be given to you only when you were ready to understand its meaning, Halvar said, extending the ring toward Kara with hands that trembled slightly. It has been worn by the rulers of the northern clans for 300 years, passed down through a bloodline that reaches back to the gods themselves. Kara stared at the ring without taking it, understanding that the moment she slipped it onto her finger, her life would change irrevocably. The weight of kingship was not measured in gold or jewels, but in the thousands of lives that would hang in the balance of every decision she made. Once she claimed this inheritance, there would be no returning to the simple dream of anonymous exile in distant lands. "The riders," Eric the Silent said urgently, pointing toward the valley below, where 6 horsemen had emerged from the tree line and were beginning their ascent toward their position. Even at this distance, the leading rider's yellow beard was clearly visible, marking him as Björn Ragnarsson himself, rather than one of Vigdis's household warriors. "So," Magnus Stormcrow observed with grim humor, "the spurned bridegroom comes to claim his prize personally. That speaks to either great passion or wounded pride, and I suspect it is the latter." Halvar studied the approaching riders with the tactical eye of a man who had survived more battles than he cared to count. 6 against 8 should be manageable odds, but they have the advantage of knowing this terrain. Björn has hunted these mountains since childhood. Numbers mean nothing if we choose our ground wisely, Gunnar Bloodaxe said, his scarred hand already checking the balance of his weapons. "Let them come to us in a place where their horses are useless and their numbers count for nothing." But Kara was thinking beyond the immediate tactical situation, her mind racing through the larger implications of what was about to unfold. If Björn had come himself, rather than sending men to drag her back for judgment, it meant that the political situation had deteriorated even further than the merchants had suggested. A Jarl's son did not personally pursue an exile unless the stakes had risen beyond mere injured pride. "He knows," she said suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking together in her mind. "Somehow Björn has learned about my true parentage. That is why he comes himself. He sees an opportunity to claim not just a bride, but a throne." The implications were staggering. If Björn could force her into marriage now, after her true heritage had been revealed, he would become the consort of the future ruler of the northern clans. The political power such a union would bring him was worth far more than the original alliance it had been meant to secure. "Then we cannot allow him to take you alive," Olaf Ironarm said with quiet finality. The gentle giant's words carried the weight of absolute commitment, and Kara felt her throat tighten with emotion at the loyalty these men had shown her. "There is another way," she said slowly, the ancient seal ring seeming to pulse with possibility in Halvar's outstretched palm. "If I claim my birthright here and now before witnesses, then I'm no longer an exile to be dragged back in chains. I become a queen, defending her sovereignty against foreign aggression." The silence that followed her words was profound, broken only by the distant sound of hoofbeats growing steadily closer. Each man of Halvar's warband understood the choice she was offering them. They could remain masterless warriors protecting a fugitive, or they could become the founding members of a royal guard defending their sovereign. "The coronation of a queen requires certain traditions to be observed," Magnus said carefully. "Oaths must be sworn, allegiances declared, the proper words spoken before the gods and witnessed by men of honor." "Then let us observe them," Kara replied, finally reaching out to take the seal ring from Halvar's hands. The gold was warm against her skin, as if it had been waiting all these years to return to its rightful owner. As she slipped it onto her finger, she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, not just acceptance of power, but acceptance of responsibility for wielding it wisely. What followed was unlike any coronation ceremony in the long history of the northern clans. There was no great hall filled with nobles, no priests chanting ancient liturgies, no crowds of people cheering their new ruler. Instead, there were 7 battle-hardened warriors kneeling in the dirt of a mountain clearing, swearing oaths of loyalty to a woman who had been cast out and exiled just days before. Halvar was the first to kneel, his weathered face solemn with the weight of the moment. "I swear by the runes and the ravens, by the sacred bonds that tie deed to consequence, that I will serve Kara Eriksdottir as my queen and sovereign, offering my sword and my life in defense of her rightful claim." One by one, the others followed his example. Olaf Ironarm's deep voice rumbled like distant thunder as he repeated the ancient words. Gunnar Bloodaxe spoke his oath with the precision of a man who understood that words, once spoken, became chains that bound the soul. Even young Thorgun and Bjorn the Young swore their allegiance with voices that cracked with emotion and determination. When Eric the Silent finally spoke his oath, the words carried extra weight for their rarity. "I have followed Halvar One-Eye through 7 years of wandering, but I will follow Queen Kara through whatever storms may come. My bow and my blade are hers until death claims me." As the last echoes of their oaths faded into the mountain air, Kara felt the full weight of what she had accepted settling onto her shoulders. These men had chosen to bind their fates to hers, trusting that she would prove worthy of the loyalty they offered. The responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. "My first command as your queen," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised even herself, "is that you remember we are no longer bound by the old rules that govern exiles and outlaws. We represent legitimate sovereignty now, and our enemies will be treated accordingly." The approaching riders had reached the steep section of the path where the horses would have to pick their way carefully between loose stones and hidden crevices. Björn Ragnarsson had dismounted and was leading his mount by the reins, his yellow beard glinting in the sunlight as he climbed steadily toward their position. "He brings 5 men," Thorgun observed, his young eyes sharp with the clarity of someone who had learned to read tactical situations quickly. "All mounted, all armed with sword and spear. They expect to overwhelm us through superior numbers and mobility." "Let them come," Kara said, surprised by the steel she heard in her own voice. "I would speak with this man who thought to buy me like cattle at market. Let him see what his proposed bride has become." As they waited for the final confrontation to begin, Kara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been a powerless girl, subject to her father's will and trapped by traditions she could not challenge. Now she wore the seal ring of ancient kings and commanded the loyalty of warriors who had chosen to follow her into battle. The transformation was more than political. It was spiritual, a fundamental change in how she understood herself and her place in the world. The frightened exile who had knelt in the dirt while her head was shaved had died somewhere on the mountain paths. In her place stood a queen who would not yield her sovereignty to any man, no matter what force he brought to bear. "Are you ready for this?" Halvar asked quietly, his remaining eye studying her face with the intensity of a man trying to read the future in present expressions. Kara looked down at the seal ring on her finger, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. The ruby at its center seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, as if the ancient kings who had worn it before her were lending their strength to the battle ahead. "I have been ready all my life," she replied, and realized as she spoke the words that they were true. Every act of defiance, every moment of stubborn pride, every choice to stand for principle rather than convenience had been preparing her for this moment when she would finally claim the power to change the world. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed off the mountain walls as Björn and his men began the final ascent to their position. Soon, words would give way to action, and the future of the northern clans would be decided by the clash of steel and the courage of those willing to die for their beliefs. But Kara no longer feared the outcome. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it not as a victim, but as a queen surrounded by men who had chosen to follow her into legend or death. The ancient seal ring on her finger was proof that some inheritances were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost might be. The ceremonial sword of truth that Halvar drew from its ancient sheath was a blade forged in the time of legends, when the gods still walked among mortals, and justice was determined by the strength of a warrior's arm. Its steel gleamed like captured starlight, unmarked by rust or nick, despite having tasted the blood of 100 trials by combat. Along its fuller ran runic inscriptions that spoke of oaths binding and truths revealed, while its crossguard bore the twisted tree symbol that marked it as a weapon of the royal house. This blade has never known defeat when wielded in the cause of justice, Halvar said, as he presented the sword to Kara with ceremonial reverence. It was your grandfather's and his grandfather's before him. Let it serve you now as it served them. Kara's fingers closed around the leather-wrapped grip, feeling the perfect balance of the weapon and the weight of history it carried. The sword seemed to pulse with life in her hands, as if awakening from long slumber to serve its rightful wielder once again. She had trained with practice blades in her father's hall, but this was something altogether different, a weapon that demanded not just skill, but worthiness from those who would claim it. Björn Ragnarsson crested the final rise with his 5 companions, their mail shirts gleaming dully in the morning light and their weapons already drawn. His yellow beard was braided with gold wire that caught the sun, and his pale eyes held the confident arrogance of a man who had never doubted his right to take whatever he desired. "Kara Vigdottir," he called out across the clearing, his voice carrying the formal tones of official proclamation. "By the laws of blood and marriage contract, you belong to me. Surrender yourself and these masterless dogs who harbor you, and I will show mercy in your judgment." "I am no longer Kara Vigdottir," she replied, her voice ringing clear and strong across the mountain air. "I am Kara Eriksdottir, daughter of Erik Bloodaxe, and rightful heir to the throne of the northern clans. You have no authority over me, and no right to demand my surrender." The ancient seal ring on her finger caught the light as she raised her hand, its ruby blazing like a coal plucked from the heart of a forge. Björn's eyes widened as he recognized the significance of what he was seeing, his confident expression faltering for the first time since his arrival. "Impossible," he breathed. But even as he spoke the denial, his tactical mind was already adjusting to this new reality. A marriage to the true heir of Erik Bloodaxe's line would give him even greater power than he had originally sought, making the prize worth whatever risk was necessary to claim it. "The ring can be taken from a corpse as easily as from a living hand," one of his companions muttered, a scarred warrior whose reputation for cruelty rivaled his master's own. "Dead queens make no demands, but they also bear no heirs," Björn replied thoughtfully, studying Kara with the calculating gaze of a merchant evaluating valuable merchandise. "No, I think this prize is worth taking alive, even if it requires breaking a few bones to ensure compliance." The insult struck Kara's newly awakened royal dignity like a physical blow, and she felt the ceremonial sword pulse with responsive anger in her grip. Around her, Halvar's warband, her warband now, shifted into combat positions with the fluid precision of men who had fought together for years. "You speak of breaking bones," she said, her voice deadly calm, despite the fury burning in her chest. "But I wonder if you have the courage to face me in single combat, as honor demands. Or do you prefer to hide behind hired swords like the coward you have always been?" The challenge hung in the mountain air like the ring of steel on steel, formal and binding according to the ancient laws that governed disputes between nobles. Björn could not refuse without losing face before his men, but accepting meant risking everything on the outcome of personal combat against an opponent whose skills were unknown. "You would face me yourself?" he asked, incredulity coloring his voice. "A woman who has held a sword for what days? Against a warrior who has killed more men than you have years?" "I would face the man who sought to buy me like livestock," Kara replied, raising the ceremonial sword so its blade caught the morning light. "I would show him what he tried to purchase, And let the gods judge which of us deserves to leave this place alive. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Björn's features as he weighed the implications of her challenge. The woman who stood before him bore little resemblance to the defiant but powerless girl he had expected to find. This was something else entirely, a queen in truth as well as title, surrounded by loyal warriors and armed with both steel and righteous anger. But pride and greed proved stronger than caution, and his expression hardened into familiar arrogance. "Very well," he said, drawing his own blade with a flourish meant to intimidate. "Let us settle this as our ancestors did with honor and steel. When you lie bleeding in the dirt, perhaps you will finally understand a woman's proper place." The circle formed naturally, warriors from both sides, creating the sacred boundary within which the combat would take place. Ancient tradition demanded that no interference be offered once the challenge was accepted, leaving the outcome to the will of the gods and the skill of the combatants. As Kara stepped into that circle, the ceremonial sword balanced perfectly in her hands. She felt the weight of destiny settling around her like a mantle. This was the moment toward which her entire life had been leading, the test that would prove whether she was truly worthy of the crown she claimed, or merely another pretender to be swept aside by those with greater strength. The crown of the true heir materialized. From Halvar's pack like a piece of captured sunlight, wrought from electrum and set with sapphires that held the deep blue of northern skies. It was not the massive, ornate headpiece that southern kings favored, but something far more practical, a circlet that could be worn into battle, its weight distributed perfectly to avoid hampering a warrior's movements. Ancient runes ran around its circumference, spelling out the names of the 7 great clans that had sworn fealty to the northern throne in the time of legends. "When you have proven your right to rule," Halvar said quietly, holding the crown where only Kara could see it, "this will mark you as queen before all the world. But first, you must survive to claim it." The combat began with the clash of steel on steel, Björn's heavier blade striking Kara's sword with enough force to jar her arms to the shoulders. He was strong, stronger than she had anticipated, and his technique spoke of years spent training with the finest weapons masters gold could buy. But strength and skill were not the only factors that determined the outcome of battle. As Kara had learned during her brief time with Halvar's warband, she gave ground before his initial assault, using her smaller size and greater agility to stay just beyond the reach of his crushing blows. The ceremonial sword felt alive in her hands, its perfect balance allowing her to parry strikes that should have shattered her guard and respond with counterattacks that forced Björn to respect her reach. "Is this the famous warrior prowess of the Ragnarsson line?" she taunted as his sword whistled past her ear by mere inches. "I have seen farm boys with better form." The insult had its intended effect, causing Björn's careful technique to deteriorate into the wild swings of a man fighting with emotion rather than skill. His greater strength worked against him now, each missed blow leaving him momentarily off balance and vulnerable to the precise cuts that Kara delivered in return. Around the circle, the watching warriors maintained the sacred silence demanded by tradition, but their eyes tracked every movement of the combatants with the intensity of men who understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Never in the long history of the northern clans had a woman challenged a man to trial by combat for the right to rule, and the outcome would echo through the generations. Blood began to flow as Kara's blade found its mark across Björn's sword arm, opening a shallow cut that would weaken his grip with each passing moment. The ceremonial sword seemed to guide her attacks, seeking vulnerable points in his mail with the precision of a weapon that had tasted victory in 100 such contests. But Björn was far from defeated, and desperation made him more dangerous rather than less. Abandoning all pretense of honorable combat, he launched himself forward in a tackle that drove both fighters to the ground, his greater weight pinning Kara beneath him as he reached for the dagger at his belt. "You should have accepted your place," he snarled, his breath hot and rank against her face as the dagger's point pressed against her throat. Now you die as you lived, defiant and stupid. But Kara had not spent days learning from Eric the Silent without absorbing some of his lessons about fighting when conventional weapons were useless. Her knee came up hard between Björn's legs, doubling him over in agony and allowing her to roll free of his weight. The ceremonial sword had fallen from her grasp during the struggle, but her mother's eating knife, the blade that had once saved Halvar's life, was still tucked in her belt. The small weapon flashed silver in the morning light as it found the gap between Björn's mail shirt and his helm, sliding between vertebrae with the precision of a surgeon's cut. His eyes widened in shock and disbelief as the life drained out of them. His grand ambitions ending not with the clash of great swords, but with the whisper of a blade, no longer than a child's finger. "You should have learned," Kara said quietly as Björn's body went limp beneath her, "that a woman's worth is not measured by her willingness to submit." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of ravens wheeling overhead. Björn's companions stared at their fallen leader with expressions ranging from shock to calculation, clearly reassessing their situation now that the man who had hired their swords lay dead in the mountain dirt. It was Halvar who broke the spell, stepping forward to retrieve the ceremonial sword and present it to Kara with formal reverence. "The trial by combat is concluded," he announced, in a voice that carried to every corner of the clearing. "The gods have rendered their judgment, and Kara Eriksdottir stands proven in her right to rule." With steady hands that betrayed none of the trembling she felt inside, Kara accepted the crown of the true heir and placed it upon her own head. The weight of it was less than she had expected, but the responsibility it represented seemed to press down upon her shoulders like the mountains themselves. "I am Kara Eriksdottir," she proclaimed, her voice carrying across the clearing with royal authority. "Daughter of Eric Bloodaxe and rightful queen of the northern clans. Let all who hear these words know that the old ways of forcing daughters into unwanted marriages die here, in this place, with this man who sought to buy what could never be sold." The crown caught the morning light like captured stars, marking her transformation. From exile to sovereign, complete at last, the new clan banner that flew above their settlement 3 years later bore symbols that would have been unthinkable when Kara first knelt in the dirt of her father's courtyard, woven from the finest wool and dyed with colors that caught the northern light like captured rainbows. It displayed not the traditional beasts of war and conquest, but images that spoke of different values entirely, a woman and man standing as equals, children playing freely beneath protective trees, and ships sailing toward distant horizons with sails full of hope rather than hunger. The settlement itself sprawled along the shores of a sheltered bay in the Iron Hills, where Eric Bloodaxe had built his final stronghold before passing peacefully into the realm of his ancestors. But the community that had grown around Kara's throne bore little resemblance to the traditional model of a royal court, with its rigid hierarchies and endless ceremonies of submission. Here, daughters learned to fight alongside sons, and marriages were contracted only with the free consent of both parties. The old laws that had treated women as property to be bought and sold had been replaced with new customs that recognized the inherent worth of every person, regardless of gender or birth. It was a revolution built not through conquest, but through example, proving that different ways of living were not only possible but profitable. Kara stood on the great hall's steps, watching as delegations from a dozen clans prepared to depart after the autumn assembly. They carried with them more than trade agreements and military alliances. They bore the seeds of change that would reshape the northern world in ways both subtle and profound. Young women who had seen female warriors training in the courtyard would remember those images when they returned home to face their own arranged marriages. Sons who had witnessed their queen commanding respect through competence rather than demanding it through violence would carry different expectations about leadership into their own futures. The coastal clans have agreed to adopt the new marriage laws, Halvar reported as he joined her on the steps. Grey now touched his temples more heavily than before, and the years of peace had softened some of the harder edges of his warrior's bearing. But his remaining eye still held the keen intelligence that had made him such a valuable advisor. It will take time for the customs to change completely, but the foundation has been laid. Beside him stood Magnus Stormcrow, his weathered face creased with satisfaction as he reviewed the maps and trade agreements that had been negotiated during the assembly. "The merchant routes are expanding faster than we anticipated," he said, rolling up a chart that showed shipping lanes stretching from the northern seas to the Mediterranean markets. "When word spreads that our ports offer fair dealing and safe passage, prosperity follows." The prosperity was visible everywhere Kara looked. The harbour held twice as many ships as it had 3 years ago, their holds filled with goods from across the known world. The streets bustled with merchants, craftsmen and scholars drawn by the opportunities that flourished under her rule. Most importantly, the faces she saw were bright with hope rather than dulled by the grinding desperation that had marked too many lives under the old ways. Eric the Silent approached with his usual economy of movement, but the smile that crossed his scarred features spoke volumes about his contentment with their new life. "The children have finished their lessons," he said, nodding toward the training ground where young people of both sexes were practicing with sword and bow under the guidance of Thorgan and Bjorn, now seasoned warriors in their own right. Among those students, Kara could see faces that reminded her of her own younger self, girls with fire in their eyes, and boys learning that true strength came from protecting rather than dominating. They would grow up in a world where their choices were their own to make, where courage was valued more than compliance, and where the accident of birth determined opportunity rather than destiny. "Any word from the southern clans?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Vigdis still refuses all overtures," Halvar replied with a slight shake of his head. "Pride runs deep in that bloodline, and admitting error has never been one of his strengths. But his younger warriors are beginning to ask questions about why their neighbors prosper while they struggle with the same old conflicts." Kara felt a familiar pang at the mention of the man who had raised her, complicated emotions that time had not entirely resolved. She bore him no hatred. Hate was a luxury she could not afford as a ruler, but neither could she forget the lesson his betrayal had taught about the difference between love and possession. As evening approached and the last of the delegations disappeared over the horizon, Kara found herself walking along the shore with Halvar, their footsteps marking a path they had traced countless times during their years together. The sea stretched before them like hammered silver, its surface reflecting the first stars of night. "Do you ever regret the path we chose?" she asked, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of long partnership. Their marriage 2 years ago had surprised no one who knew them, though it had scandalized traditionalists who believed queens should marry for alliance rather than affection. "Which path?" Halvar replied with the hint of humor that had grown more common as the weight of constant warfare lifted from his shoulders. "The one that led us from that courtyard where you knelt in the dirt, or the one we walk together now?" "Both. All of them." He was quiet for a long moment, his remaining eye studying the horizon where their ships carried news of their success to distant lands. "I regret the pain that was necessary to bring us here," he said finally. "I regret the lives lost in conflicts that could have been avoided if change had come sooner. But I do not regret the destination we reached, or the company I found for the journey." The new clan banner snapped in the evening breeze above them, its bright colors visible even in the growing darkness. It flew not as a symbol of conquest, but as a promise that the future could be different from the past, that courage could triumph over custom, and that love freely given was stronger than any chain forged by obligation. In the distance, children's laughter echoed from the settlement's streets, the sound carrying with it the hope of generations yet to come. They would grow up in a world shaped by the choices made in a mountain clearing 3 years ago, when a broken woman chose to stand rather than kneel, and when 7 warriors chose loyalty over safety. The stars emerged fully as they stood together on the shore, mapping the same constellations that had guided their ancestors across unknown seas to build new homes in distant lands. But now those stars seemed to promise journeys not of conquest, but of discovery. Voyages that would carry the seeds of change to every corner of the northern world. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. But sometimes, standing up for what you believe creates a family bound not by blood but by choice, and builds a legacy that will outlast any throne carved from tradition and fear.